global engagement. We're really happy to have this session this morning with Dr. Emma Glotz. And actually came up when our education abroad staff was talking with Annette Molyneux about more ways that we can support our faculty and staff and our students while they're overseas. And she said, oh, we have this great workshop that Emma's been doing. So we're delighted that she was willing to do it for us, and it will have a little bit more of an international focus. And I thought, since we're a small group, maybe we'll just have everybody go around and introduce themselves and say who they are and where they're from, and if they're leading a trip soon, you can also mention that as well. So, you want to?
Okay, sure. Hi, I'm Connie Perry. I'm in the Department of Health Administration and College Administration Professions. And I have led trips to Costa Rica to learn about the healthcare system there. And one of our faculty members is going to be doing that hopefully this spring.
Hi, I'm Robert Ganone, and I work for Wilboa College of Business as a career advisor, and I'm doing my first trip abroad in September, so we're going to Peru with the MBA students who are residents.
Hi everyone, I'm Tasha Schreckler. I work in global engagement, and I work a lot with our faculty on developing intensive courses abroad, and also teach two intensive courses abroad in Cuba.
And I'm Brad from the Department of Architecture, Design, and Urban. And I'll be leading a trip to Barcelona with Gail Rubin, who will be here shortly in September.
Hi everyone, Elizabeth Beine. I work in the global engagement office. I'm Claire Ann Wallach. I'm a doctoral intern at the Constant Center.
And you can take it away, Emma.
I think we might have
I'm
missed
sorry.
I'm late. Sorry about that. Jess Ballinger, I'm also in the Health Administration Department. I'll be leading a intensive course abroad in September, my first ever, to Chile.
Get some coffee. I am actually monitoring it online in Zoom stream. There were 3 questions that are in audio now. Gina, Ellen is online, and Casey, maybe Melissa. Okay, great.
Hello, online people. Welcome. And welcome to you all. It's nice to meet you all. I'm getting real travel envy, hearing about all the exciting places that you'll be going. So am I right that you all pretty much will go abroad with students at times, but also work locally at students in between? Is that right? Okay. Okay, so hopefully we can kind of have a discussion of both and how you support students depending on the situation. So I'm here to talk to you about how to support students that are experiencing mental health difficulties. I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation. I'm sure in the various ways that you work with students, we might have overlap with the students that we work with. Perhaps that you've had students that you've referred to the counseling center, or you've thought about, or you wondered, should I not refer them to the counseling center? And I'm sure that we at the counseling center have referred students to you in all the capacities that you're there to support students as well. So I think it's great to be able to connect and have a conversation together. I think we have about, welcome. I think we have about like an hour and a half scheduled, right? And part of that is with the intention to leave plenty of time for Q&A and discussion afterwards. I'd also love for it to be conversational as we go along, so I hope that you'll feel free to kind of pop up a hand if there's anything you have a question about or want to talk about a little bit more. So part of the reason why it's important that we're having this conversation across the university is because the rise that we're seeing in students that are struggling with issues related to mental health. And this is a trend that we're not just seeing at Drexel, this is occurring at universities across the country. So these stats up here are from college counseling centers across the country. That 30% increase in college students seeking counseling services. That's actually just from the year 2009 to 2015. And that number has only increased further since then as well. So there's a few different contributing factors to that number, right? So it's not necessarily all like cause for concern. Some of that increase is because there's a decrease in mental health stigma, right? People feel more comfortable. This is a generation that feels more comfortable kind of seeking support, talking about mental health issues, talking about emotions. Some of that number is hopefully because we've gotten better at universities at recognizing students in distress, referring students to support, and getting them connected with support that they need. So that's definitely potential contributors to that number. And also, it seems like there's a rise in students that experience significant mental health diagnoses, mental health distress. And also, there seems to be, universities seem to be noticing kind of across the country that college students today are also having more trouble dealing with the stressors of everyday life as well. So one of the things that we're going to talk about, and I'll elaborate on this a little bit more, is kind of how we, as those that work and support students, can sort of recognize the difference in kind of the level of support students need and connecting them with the right level of support. So these are from across the country the top concerns that students seeking counseling name as their primary concerns, and this closely maps onto what we see here at Drexel too, with kind of anxiety and depression being the topmost concerns, most frequent that we hear, followed by things like academic issues, relationship issues. I'm curious if this data kind of maps onto your experience with the students that you see and that you work with. Just head nods or any thoughts? Yeah? Okay. So my hope is today, as I kind of mentioned, I'd like to focus on sort of two main things. I find that oftentimes faculty, staff are interested in information around how do I recognize if a student is in need of mental health support, and what do I do if a student's going through crisis? Sort of how do I know how to respond and what the protocol is? So we're definitely going to talk about that, and hopefully by the end help you feel a little bit more empowered to handle those sorts of situations. And another thing that we're going to focus on is kind of recognizing when a student might be going through something difficult, might be feeling distressed, but actually seems like they're able to get through that moment sort of on their own with a little extra support, and how to help students in those scenarios and when to know kind of what the right way to go with it is. Does that make sense? So some of the reason why we kind of want to address these two focuses is the importance of sort of having a balanced approach, such that we're recognizing when students need a little more support and making sure that we connect them with that support, while also making sure that we're not so heavy-handed in that we're unintentionally sending a message to students that they can't handle something if they actually have all the strengths that they need to get through that situation. And so, how do we find that balance so that we're empowering students and kind of helping them notice their own strengths and also giving them support when it's needed? So, again, this is something that universities across the country are kind of grappling with and trying to address. So, sort of a hot term right now is this idea of resilience, right? So how can universities help students kind of increase their sense of resiliency? And how can we create a culture amongst the college of resiliency? So when we talk about this term, one way to define it is the ability to adjust to a stressful circumstance and then persevere, right? So it's kind of the growth that you experience when you get through something difficult and you feel like, hey, I can do that, and I'm more confident now that I can get through that. So how do we offer support that kind of encourages that for students? And one of the reasons why this is important to talk about is because just as humans, any one of us, we naturally look to others to inform how we should be feeling or reacting to something, right? We kind of feed off of others and take in that information. So like if while I was standing up here giving this presentation to you all, if your eyes were darting around frantically and you were looking for the exit and you were starting to get up out of your chair, I would start thinking like, whoa, what am I missing, right? I would get nervous, and that would inform my feelings, right? And so similarly, we're in a position in the work that we do with students in kind of modeling for them feelings of like resiliency and confidence and overcoming challenging situations, right? And just the way that we interact with our students can inform them a lot. So I want to do a quick exercise with you all. If you have a piece of paper or your computer, I guess you could do this on your phone too. I'd like you to just quickly jot down 3 times in your life that you think you experienced significant moments of growth. So the 3 greatest moments of growth in your life. I'm not going to ask you to share exactly what those moments are, so like a period. So if you've got down at least, a few, 1 or 2, and what I'd like you to do is just raise your hand if at least one of those moments or one of those periods involves some kind of significant discomfort. Okay, so those online, every hand is raised. Keep your hand up if every one of those moments involves some kind of discomfort or something challenging. So still every hand is raised, right? So, yeah.
I just wanted to say for those of you that are online, I am unable to join your chat, but I'm seeing your questions. So if you just want to type in your questions, if you have any, then I can voice them and they will be addressed.
So to mic that, those online, we can't interact with your chat, but we can see it. So if you have a question, you can just throw it in that chat and then and I'll address it. So the idea being that growth and resiliency go hand in hand and are contingent on some challenge, right? We go through distress, we go through challenge, and that's how we grow. Our bodies are kind of made up this way, right? Our muscles grow after they've been kind of harmed in some way or they've been put under stress in some way, right? Our immune system. So this is kind of how growth works. And so for all of us, when we go through a challenging situation and we come out the other side, we build some resilience, and resiliency comes with all of these benefits up here. So these are some additional traits or abilities that have been tied to correlate with resilience through research, right? So better ability to cope, better ability to adapt to transition, right? So something that I'm sure is very applicable to something like studying abroad, being in a new place, right? So if we start off thinking about kind of when are the times and the moments where we want to kind of lean into that, like empowering students and their strengths and helping them cultivate a sense of resiliency, then we want to think about how do we do that? How do we go about doing that? When is that enough? And also when does a student need more? So let's start off with how do we go about doing that? So when I was thinking about this, kind of walking through answering this question, something that occurred to me was that it's got to start with contact with the student, right? It's got to be in a moment where you're with the student. And it seemed to me like contact with the student probably starts one of 2 ways. Either a student reaches out to you, or you reach out to a student, right? And in terms of this topic in particular, we might be even more focused on either a student shares that they're going through something difficult with you, or maybe you have some concerns and you ask a student what's going on and ask if they're going through something difficult. Does that sound right so far? That's kind of like the two ways that situation might come up. Okay, I see head nods. So I'm curious, in those times where it's been you reaching out to a student, right? If a student reaches out to you, they kind of took care of the first part of it, right? They put it on your radar that they're going through something difficult and they might need some support. I'm curious in those times where you've maybe had some concerns and initiated a conversation or reached out to a student, if anybody feels comfortable sharing some of the things they noticed that led them to want to reach out or kind of ask a student what's going on.
I had a really strange situation where there was a newspaper article printed about a student parent who
Yeah.
had gotten in trouble, and because I knew her well and she told me about her life, but right away it clicked in that it was her parent.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did send her an email and say, I think she actually sent me the email first and said, can we talk? And I said, I heard what happened. We can meet off campus if you want.
Yeah.
So I guess she approached me first, but I felt that I was going to have to approach her, not because we had just had this conversation. It was about her family, so I instantly knew.
Yeah.
It was difficult.
Yeah, and kind of a unique situation and
It was
such.
very strange.
But I think some maybe like relatable features are, and so for those of that can't hear online, it was a situation where something was printed in a newspaper that you knew because of your past experience with the student that it related to the student and could potentially be a pretty stressful thing. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah.
And so some similar factors there being like in some ways the student reached out, but also because of your unique knowledge of the student and your relationship with them, you also had on your radar something that could be pretty stressful for them. And you also kind of reached out to them as well and offered support. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Any other examples of, yeah?
Well, I wouldn't say often, but a fairly consistent thing.
Mhm.
A student will become, really anxious about, basic assignments.
Mhm.
Hasn't, it just seems unusual. Either it's a change for the student, if it's been over time in the quarter, or it's a new quarter and the student's just like, before class has started, asking for permission.
Yeah.
So I just, asked, is there anything you want to talk about? Or,
Yeah. So a couple of things that I hear in what you're saying is sometimes it could be a matter of, I've known this student across the span of time and like something seems different, like some, anxious behaviors are like increasing, right? There's some like noticeable shift in their behavior. Sure, or they stop coming to class, yeah.
one way or the other.
And then also it sounds like, or even just in, without the knowledge of the student over time, if they're kind of acting in a way that maybe isn't proportional to kind of what's going on for them compared to other students, right? So it's the beginning of a term and they're already kind of reaching out, asking a ton of questions, like trying to make appointments, or I don't know what it might look like, but you're kind of comparing it to like, this seems unusual.
Right.
Yeah. Other experiences or thoughts?
I've
Yeah.
been on trips where I would notice that the dynamics between certain students change abruptly.
So noticing a difference, and that's seems like probably one of the ways in which your position might be unique when you're abroad with students is you might also be able to observe their dynamics with others. And sort of like, oh, is there an abrupt shift in how they're interacting with others? Or I could imagine, like, kind of similarly, just comparing sort of their interactions to everybody else's. It's like something's going on that's different with this student. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So thank you for sharing all of that. It seems like, right, what we're getting at is like, what are the things that you noticed that can kind of give you an idea that the student might be experiencing some distress, right? So I have this chart, recognizing signs of distress. There's different kind of categories: academic, physical indicators, safety risks, psychological indicators. What I don't want you to do is get overwhelmed by this chart, right? There's a lot of information on here. You might not even be able to see it all that well, right? And that's okay. This is certainly not information that you need to memorize and feel like you need to be able to be on the lookout and spot any one of these indicators at a moment's notice. What you might find if you take a look at some of these is that a lot of these things you would notice anyway, right? Like you were saying, it would kind of stand out as very different than maybe their peers. And a lot of it also reflects sort of when there's a sudden change, right? So, I mean, garbled, slurred speech, you're going to recognize that. You're going to think that's off, right? Excessive tearfulness. You're going to notice if one of your students is in tears, right? So a lot of these things are just going to naturally pop up on yours or anybody's radar. And then the other thing, I think really one of the biggest take-homes, right? So there's an element of that that's like, trust your gut. And then I think the other take-home is anytime that you notice there's some kind of a noticeable change in the student's behavior, you can notice something is different. As a good sign. It's a good reason to reach out and have a conversation with a student. Not because it necessarily means they're experiencing a mental health crisis or even anything that's diagnosable, but just because it's a good reason to check in. It's a good reason to have a conversation with a student. I think sometimes there can be a little bit of like a discomfort or hesitancy to have a conversation, to initiate a conversation. I think that might vary from person to person. But I think it's an understandable hesitancy. I think sometimes it might come from a place of like, what if I like open up these doors and I get a lot of information and I don't know what to do with that and I don't know how to help the student and now I feel kind of like roped in or responsible and that's really not my job or my role, right? Or something that I'm like qualified for, which I think is really, like I said, an understandable hesitation. And what I hope is that by the end of our conversation today, that you might feel more empowered to have these kinds of conversations with students, that you might feel like you have a little bit more of like tools to navigate such situations. Because really, just information is power. The more you know about a student, the better. Not because it then becomes your responsibility, but then you can find the person who can help that student, right? Or you can feel more informed about what that student might need and connect them with the support that they need. And hopefully as we go through sort of like how to go about doing that, my hope is that you feel more comfortable in that situation. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So I'm curious, we went through some of the like top concerns that students come to college counseling centers regarding. I saw some head nods that some of what you see is similar. I'm just curious, like what kinds of issues or conflicts do the students that you work with often come to you with? Like what are some things that you see often students struggle with? Yeah.
Well, I teach history.
Mm-hmm.
It means a lot of emotionally difficult material.
Sure.
So I've had students who, particularly, I'm thinking particularly someone in the spring who couldn't just have an anxiety attack, and I would show them certain films and stuff.
Sure.
So,
So
I've seen others who it was pretty clear they were having trouble with what we were seeing.
Sure, so some difficult reactions to some content in class that can show up like an anxiety attack in class, right? Okay. Other, yep.
Did
stress, yeah. Overwhelmed with work, yeah. Mhm. Yep.
I seem that I have more students who have pronounced social anxiety.
Social anxiety, yeah, absolutely. We see that a lot.
And their ability to interact with others is sometimes very, very difficult.
Yeah, the ability to interact, to make connections with other people. Mm-hmm. Did I see the hand over here?
Yeah, some of the students I work with have culture shock.
Culture shock, yeah. Culture shock, homesickness for international students or for incoming freshmen. I think particularly for international students, maybe. Sure. Mm-hmm. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I have some students that face discrimination and racism
Sure.
from faculty.
Mm-hmm. Dealing with discrimination, being on the receiving end of racism, even from people that are in a position that should be making them feel safe and comfortable. Absolutely.
I think in the international context, we have a lot of students who are just kind of anxious about that unknown environment that they can't really control. Some students find this fascinating and a great ride, and other students don't feel as comfortable kind of outside of, you know, their bubble in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
You know, so that
Yeah.
can be stressful for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So particularly with, you know, the experience of study abroad, that could bring up some unique experiences too. I took some guesses off of some of the things that we see often. I hear some overlap. And then I can imagine, right, particularly with studying abroad, there's a loss of routine. Maybe my go-to people I feel comfortable with aren't around me anymore. I miss being home. It's hard to reach out to family. There's a time zone difference. Culture shock with studying abroad. Kind of everything is unfamiliar. And also preparing for it, kind of, I'm going into the unknown and the anxiety that can come with that. Absolutely. So when students come to us with these kinds of challenges, what do we do? How do we work with them? How do we support them? So I think an important point I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'm curious if you're willing to share it all. When you're in situations with students that are experiencing this and maybe sharing some of these concerns with you, I'm curious if you feel comfortable sharing, what feelings does that sometimes bring up for you, kind of in the moment with that student? Yeah.
I feel unprepared in some ways, really knowing what to do with the people who have severe social anxiety. I think there's some around the autism issue.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know enough.
Unprepared.
And I remember once I was working with a kid, and we were in this large room, we were all working, and I just kind of did like this, and the quickly said, I have tachycardia. And it's like, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty quickly.
So unprepared, and sometimes that can come with like nervousness or fear of like, I'm going to do or say the wrong thing. I don't quite know like what to do. So some nervousness too, maybe. Other feelings that can come up when working with students when they bring up concerns.
Honestly, I don't even know how to express this right, but crossing the line with,
Mm-hmm.
you know, with with how to help a student or what questions are appropriate. So at one point, many, many years ago, I remember asking a student, she was really struggling, she kept coming to me for help, and I asked if she had ever gone to see anybody to see if she had a learning difference.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it was a good thing to say at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was the problem. And so we had gone through PUC. And so I get nervous about what I'm allowed to say
Yeah.
or suggest and what I'm not allowed to say or suggest. So it makes me very, especially when it's a serious situation, it makes me uptight.
Sure. And you're getting at even my next question. So I'm hearing more kind of like nervousness and uncertainty. That seems to be a theme. Again, I took some guesses at kind of some of the feelings that some of these situations can bring up. think it can differ so much from person to person and person to person on the other end too, sort of the feelings that it brings up for us. Absolutely. Uncertainty, fear, what if I say the wrong thing? Sometimes there's a fear of like, what if I miss something, right? What if I'm missing something serious? Sometimes it can bring up compassion, and like real empathy or sadness for the student, I know when I work with international students and I hear about their experience kind of being in a completely new place and being far from home, which I think is similar to the experience students get going abroad, I feel so compassionate. I feel like, that's got to be so difficult. Also, I didn't necessarily hear exactly this, but just to normalize, feelings like frustration or anger are perfectly normal and understandable, right? Especially depending on how a student might go about kind of expressing their distress. And also just like our own unique characteristics that we bring to the situation too. Sometimes we have nerves that get hit as well. So perfectly understandable feelings. I'm curious with the ones we've been talking about, the feelings we've been talking about, when you feel that way, I'm curious then how that feeling can influence your behavior. And so one thing I already heard you say is sometimes if I feel kind of uncertain or nervous about saying the wrong thing, I might respond by feeling a little uptight. Maybe I'm more restrained than I would otherwise. Other experiences of how a different feeling can affect your behavior with a student?
You could appear impatient. I'm sure it's
Sure.
with difficulty with workload issues.
Yeah.
And I found sometimes that students will kind of impact the whole class
Mm-hmm.
because some of them will not be able to keep up and then say to others, so there's a sort of a class dynamic that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
That can be frustrating to faculty.
Sure.
And sometimes it's hard to deal with that in a way that you don't let your own emotions or frustration. So,
Absolutely. If I feel frustrated or if I feel impatient, then maybe I might be shorter. I might sort of end an interaction sooner than later. It's absolutely going to affect your behavior, just like all of these feelings are going to affect your behavior in different ways, right? And we might respond to them in different ways. So again, I put up just some examples. And again, getting at sort of how it can be different from person to person and situation to situation. Maybe when one person feels some fear or nervousness with a student, they might kind of take a step back. Maybe I kind of have more restraint or I withdraw a little bit. I might say less, right? I might end that conversation because I really don't want to kind of take on more than I can handle in that situation. Maybe another person, when they feel nervous or they feel afraid, they might kind of put more focus into that interaction. They might ask more questions. They might get more involved. They might kind of try to solve the problem for the student. So we can all act in such different ways, right? Oftentimes influenced by how we're feeling in the moment. So what can we do in these situations, right? What can we do for students that are experiencing some of these issues? I think an important thing to address off the bat is that a lot of times we are not going to be able to solve this student's problem, particularly in that moment. But also overall, at the end of the day, it's not our problem to solve. We absolutely should support the student and provide what help that we can. And at the end of the day, it's the student's task to work through their challenges. And that's also by kind of acknowledging that opportunity that the student has, is the opportunity that they get to kind of build that resilience that we were talking about, right? They get the opportunity to kind of think through what they really want to do, think through their options, decide how they want to go, experience some stress and discomfort and come out the other side and realize like, hey, I did that. I could do that, So it's important to remind yourself that you can't always solve the student's problem, and that's okay. So with that, what can you do? So we'll go through some different things, but kind of going back to this idea of how much of an influence we can have just in our way of interacting with the student, of kind of how they feel about themselves or feel about a situation. Sometimes a huge thing we can do right from the get-go is just being able to model for them some calmness, some confidence that they've got what they need to get through this and that we're going to help them get the support, the extra support that they might need, right? So in just kind of how we present to the student, that can be an extremely kind of healing and therapeutic interaction. You know what I mean? So that means as a first step, just kind of checking in with your own experience, right? Kind of checking in with like, how am I feeling in the moment? And what do I really want my goal to be for this interaction, right? So just kind of setting an intention. Raise your hand if you're familiar with this concept of mindfulness. Okay. Keep your hand raised if you've heard it a bunch of times, but you're really not sure what the heck it is or what it means or how to do it. Okay. See some hands raised. So if it's a concept that you've come across, but you're not, too familiar with it, a very kind of simple definition of mindfulness is awareness of the present moment. And that means kind of awareness of what's going on in your surroundings in the present moment, but it also means awareness of what's happening internally in the present moment. And that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to kind of bring it into our conversation today, because as we're talking about kind of checking in with how you're feeling in the moment with the student, that's basically mindfulness. That requires some skill, kind of noticing what's going on for you in the here and now, right? So there's a bunch of different ways that you can practice mindfulness so that you can kind of get better at doing that. It kind of crosses the spectrum of, a formal meditation where you're kind of sitting in the lotus position for an hour and just being with your own thoughts, right? All the way to sort of less formal things that you can do just as you go about your daily life. I can check in with my 5 senses, which kind of helps ground me in what's going on in the here and now, right? A common example I like to use for what mindfulness means in like your day-to-day life or how you can practice it in like a daily way is mindfulness is the difference between when I get ready in the morning and I'm taking my shower. Am I thinking about kind of the meeting that I have later today, all the things that I have to do, the presentation I'm giving, am I prepared, how do I feel about it? Rehashing a conversation in my head that I had the day before when what I should have really said is this, and the next time I see them, I'm going to say that. And, right, my mind is everywhere but where my actual body is at the moment. The difference that mindfulness might be just kind of focusing my attention on how the water feels across my skin, taking in the smells of the moment, noticing how my body's feeling, noticing if my thoughts are going to other things. I'm noticing that that's what my mind is doing, right? It's not like automatic pilot. I don't even know what I was thinking about. I'm kind of noticing, oh, my mind is going to this, and I'm going to bring it back to where I'm at in the shower, and then it's going to go again, and I'm kind of aware, right? So I'm curious because I think, people have had a lot of different levels of experience with this idea of mindfulness. I thought it might be cool to take a few minutes and do just a most basic rudimentary mindfulness meditation, basically. Would you guys be up for that? Okay, cool. If for no other reason, then why not take a little mental break and, an early Wednesday morning. It's Wednesday, right? Okay, so I'll guide you through it to give you an idea first of what we're going to do and why we're going to do it. Is I'm just going to ask you to focus on your breath. And the reason why you hear about the breath a lot, to my knowledge, why we use the breath, is because it's always there. It's a focal point that you should always have with you. If it's not there, we have bigger problems we have to address, right? You should always be breathing. And so really it's a place to focus your attention. So I'm going to ask you to focus your attention on your breath, and that just means really kind of keeping your awareness and intention on how it feels to be breathing. Right, that's something we do all day, every day, And it's pretty rare that we just like sit and focus on that experience. And what's going to happen is as I ask you to keep your attention in one place, you're going to notice that your mind starts to wander in all different kinds of places. And you're just going to practice noticing when that happens. And once you notice it's happened, bringing your attention back to where you started with the breath. And it'll happen again. You'll get distracted and you'll bring it back to the breath again. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So if you're sitting in a comfortable position, I encourage you to put both feet flat on the ground. And I also encourage you to gently close your eyes. I think it can be helpful with the focusing. And I always like to start off with just taking a few deep breaths to just kind of settle into the moment. So go ahead and take a deep breath in and slowly exhale. Another deep breath in and slowly exhale. One more deep breath in. Slowly exhale. See if you can let go of any tension your body's holding with your exhale. You can go ahead and return your breathing to just its natural rhythm. And I'm going to ask you to gently bring your attention to your breath, focusing your awareness on how it feels to be breathing. Sometimes it's helpful for people to pick a specific focal point where they experience the breath. So maybe that's how the air feels flowing in and out of your nostrils, or the feeling of your chest rising and falling. Whatever feels like a natural place for you to focus your attention. What you might already be finding is that our mind has a way to distract us with all different kinds of thoughts and pull our attention away from the breath. And that's fine. That's the mind doing exactly what it does, constantly churning up different kinds of thoughts for us. Each time that you notice this happens, though, I'd like you to just take note of where your mind wandered to and gently bring it back to the breath. And it'll happen again and again. You'll notice your mind wandered. Your mind can bring you to thoughts about the future or things that have already happened. You might even notice some judgmental thoughts, maybe even about the exercise or your ability to do the exercise. And again, all that's fine. We're just noticing when that happens and returning our attention to your breath. Let's finish up by taking one more deeper than normal breath in. Slowly exhale. And you can gently open your eyes. I'm curious how that felt for folks. Felt good? Good. Anybody feel any different than before we did the meditation? Felt more relaxed? Good. You're welcome. Anybody not feel relaxed, either while they're doing it or afterwards? Well, that's good. But it's also important, I always like to kind of correct a couple of common misconceptions about mindfulness or about meditation. It's, I feel like, commonly perceived that sort of the point of it is to feel more relaxed. And that's really not true. Sometimes that happens, and it's nice when that happens. But really, the purpose of it is to get a little bit better at noticing what's occurring for you internally, right? Noticing what's going on in your own thoughts, in your own feelings, and also at kind of redirecting your focus when you like to, right? So just observing, allowing thoughts to be there, but kind of redirecting my attention. So it doesn't always feel relaxing. If you're taking time to check in with your thoughts and you've got like a ton going on in your mind, like that can feel overwhelming. It can feel tedious, constantly like catching my distracting thoughts and bring it back to my breath. I feel like I'm always distracted. I can't do this, right? So it's important to know that even if that's the case, that doesn't mean that it's not effective to do a meditation or to do an exercise like that. So I'm hoping that it makes some sense how this applies to some of the things we've been talking about in terms of noticing what's happening for you in the moment with students. That's not the right slide. Let me find myself. Okay. So one application to a similar concept is mindful listening. So who can relate to this situation where maybe you're in a conversation or you're sitting in a meeting, maybe it's even happened during this presentation, where you all of a sudden kind of come to and you realize, I have no idea what's been being said, and I don't really know how long I haven't known what's being said, and I don't know what to say now because I don't know what's been talked about. I'll take some of the laughs as confirmation that that's a relatable experience, right? So, it happens to all of us. Mindful listening is being able to use those same kind of abilities that we just did in that meditation while you're interacting with a person, right? While you're listening. So noticing, trying to focus your attention and intention on what you're hearing and understanding it, being in the moment with the person that you're listening to. And then noticing when your mind starts to take you to other things, noticing when a certain feeling or reaction is coming up for you, noticing that and kind of refocusing on the listening and taking in what the person is sharing, right? So it's a helpful thing to notice kind of like everything that comes up for us when we're listening to a student. It's helpful with your family, it's helpful with your spouse, right? Feel free to practice it in other areas. But it's helpful for us to really be able to make sure we're getting a good idea of what a student is sharing, right? And to notice if we're getting distracted with our own reactions, which is easy to happen sometimes. Does that make sense? Okay. So which brings us to kind of, once we're there and in a position to take in what the student is saying, how do we go about understanding the problem? So we've talked about a lot of different issues, and we'll continue to talk about kind of how to help students with different kinds of distress. But I wanted to go through these three: stress, anxiety, and crisis, because I think these are ones that we see often and are a few that are particularly hard sometimes to differentiate from one another. Does that match your experience? Is that like relatable? Okay, I see some head nods. Anybody care to take a try at what the differences between at least some of these might be? Yeah.
Well, I think stress, the general reaction to something real and concrete, whereas anxiety may or may not be associated with some real stress.
Okay.
I think it's most disturbing when it feels like it's, I don't know why I feel this way, but
Sure.
I just freak out.
So you can kind of, with stress, you can kind of relate it to like a specific stressor, and anxiety.
The student is working 60 hours a week to pay the bills, and they're trying to pay the full load.
Yeah.
Of course.
Right. Right. Yeah. Whereas
That
anxiety.
probably causes anxiety, but sometimes
Anxiety can just be kind of looming. I don't know exactly where it's coming from. Sure. Other ideas about the differences between any of these?
I would just add that crisis seems acute. It's
Sure.
something that may come from either stress and or anxiety, but it's acute and there's a sense of urgency.
Sure. Crisis feels acute. It's urgent.
Yeah, navigating or supporting or addressing.
There's some like immediacy to it, right? Sure. So you're hitting on a lot of important pieces of it, and have some good ideas about some of the differences. what makes it difficult to separate some of these, especially stress and anxiety, and also crisis, some of the symptoms or the way that it presents are the same, right? So both stress and anxiety can cause physical symptoms, can cause heart racing, difficulty sleeping, muscle tension, difficulty focusing, right? So it can come up in very similar ways, but there's some important differences to stress and anxiety, which it sounds like you're kind of hitting on, right? So stress, you kind of think of it as more related to situational factors, right? And it's a little bit more proportional to the factors, right? This is like very closely to what you were sharing. So sometimes a student will come, to me and they'll say, I'm suffering from anxiety, and I ask them about, kind of what's going on, what's their life like, and it's like, well, I'm going to classes full time, but I'm also trying to work a lot, and I work on the weekends, and sometimes I work after class too, and I'm also in a sorority, and we have all these meetings. If I don't go to the meetings, I get kicked out, and I'm also in this other organization, and on and on and on, and I'm like, yeah, that's stress. Of course you're feeling that way, right? That's your body's way of telling you there's too much going on, right? So one way to think about stress is sort of a natural physiological response when our perceived demands outweigh our perceived resources to meet those demands, right? So it's kind of like a jargony way of saying, like, too much on your plate, right? When we think about anxiety, similarly, it can be less related to a situational factor, right? It can be more chronic. It can maybe stick around for longer after a situation has resolved, more likely to be disproportionate to the sort of situational factors that are related. It's tough because sometimes if somebody has anxiety, stress then increases anxiety. There can be overlap. A person can be experiencing both at the same time. A lot of times somebody with anxiety also might have some insight that the way something is affecting them doesn't feel completely proportional to the stressor or the situation. And that can add additional difficulty. That can cause some feelings of maybe like shame or being hard on myself because I don't know why I'm having such a hard time with this, Okay, and then the idea of what crisis is. So this is a tricky one because it's a term that's a colloquial term, and then it's also a clinical term. And so at the Counseling Center, when we talk about crisis, we're talking about a very specific definition of crisis. And this would be if there is sort of an immediate threat of harm or danger to the student or to others. Something that requires some immediate intervention, right? It can be a little tough because our definition of crisis can differ from a student's definition of crisis, right? They might be using that word in a different way to express how difficult something is for them or how much they're being impacted in the moment. But this is talking about kind of this clinical definition of crisis. What can also be tricky is that, remember, a student's subjective experience of a situation could be very different than our subjective experience of it. So there could be a scenario in which a failed class to us feels like a bummer, but would not necessarily lead to a threat of harm. But for another student, it could be very different. A student in financial trouble, worried about scholarships, a lot of pressure from family, and even without any of those factors, just the particular kind of character of the student. So you can't necessarily just go by the situation to know if the student is experiencing a threat of harm to themselves or to others, right? Which is why it's always important to get that information, to be willing to have a conversation and to ask some tough and sometimes uncomfortable questions. So I came up with this kind of flow chart of sort of how do you know what to do when? And how do you recognize which situation is which? So of course, it's not an exact science. but hopefully these are some helpful things to help you kind of like navigate, right? So when a student's upset but managing, right? So some kind of indicators to help you know, like, the student's upset, but they're actually maybe like coping in a healthy or appropriate way, right? It's tough because sometimes you can't necessarily go by how a student just seems in the moment. A student could be very tearful, right? But, oh, sorry, how much was I blocking out? So a student might seem very emotional or very tearful. Remember, sometimes crying is a completely appropriate, normal response to a tough situation, right? Some things that you can look for are, is a student able to engage in problem solving? Even though they're emotional and they're showing some distress, are they able to kind of think through the problem and kind of brainstorm on options and come up with something of a plan? Are they future-oriented? Are they still thinking in terms of, okay, well, here's what I can do, and here's what I want to do next, and I'm still looking forward to this, right? So they have this kind of future orientation and can think ahead. And are they able to identify their supports? Are they able to think up and identify things that are helpful for them, right? Other people that they can talk to, kind of where they want to go to help them to get through this, right? So those are all good signs that even though a student might be going through something difficult, that they actually have a lot of skills at their hands to help them get through that moment. If a student is upset and struggling, right, this is a moment where we want to refer them to future supports, to further supports, right? You might want to make a referral to the counseling center. I know this might be particular in terms of where do you refer and study when somebody is abroad, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about what some of those resources are. But some indicators would be if a student is, showing signs of distress, they're emotional, or you're noticing some things that seem off, and they're having trouble engaging in the problem solving. They're having trouble like organizing their thoughts to be able to think through kind of where they want to go from here. Can't really think up of where they could go to help them get through this moment. And also a good indicator is if it seems like they're struggling in more than one area too, right? So they're having some difficulty that is not just specific to this kind of situation, but there's some things that are kind of flowing over into a lot of other areas of life too. Does it make sense so far? And then when a student is in crisis, that's when really, and when somebody's experiencing that crisis, that there's that threat of danger or harm, this is a circumstance in which it's no longer a matter of encourage them to get some support, refer them to some supports. This is a circumstance where you need to make sure that that student connects to support, to a mental health provider or to an emergency service, right? Some signs would be if you are noticing some signs of hopelessness, right? They're saying things like, what's the point of all this? It'd be better off if I wasn't here. Nothing's going to fix this. Certainly some behavioral things that you would notice anyway, increased agitation. If you're ever starting to feel unsafe, that's a good indicator. At the end of the day, with crisis, what you need to do, and the best that you can do, is ask directly, right? Ask the question, are you having thoughts about suicide? Are you thinking about hurting somebody, right? And we'll talk through that a little bit more in terms of all the things that brings up for us when we think about asking those questions, okay? But let's kind of go through these one by one. So when it seems like a situation where a student's upset, they're going through something difficult, but they're also able to kind of problem solve and they seem like they can kind of think through it, what can we do to be helpful? So that first is model distress tolerance. This is what we were talking about and kind of checking in with yourself and being able to kind of model that calm, confident stance for them, right? As we talked about, we feel informed by the people around us, and so it's easy with a person that's experiencing distress, for us to feed off of that distress and feel stress as well. In those situations, the person in distress is kind of determining the way the conversation's going. But we can change that in the other direction as well, and that for a person in distress, if we're able to kind of display some calmness and some confidence, we can have the influence towards them to help them feel a little bit more sturdy and stable, right? Showing empathy, right? So this is important, especially when we're talking about this idea of empowering students and reinforcing their resiliency. That this doesn't mean sort of diminishing their concerns or dismissing what they're upset about. There's a way to do this in a very empathic, validating way, you know, and sometimes just being able to start by acknowledging what a student's going through, completely understand why this is so stressful, right? Can just be really helpful and also help the rest of these things go a little bit more smoothly when a student feels like you get it, you understand that I'm struggling and you understand why. Highlighting strengths, right? So thinking about the things that you can already sort of highlight from the student that they're doing well and that they've done well, and sort of the things that they've already shown, right? And that can vary depending on your experience with the student. I'm sure if you know them more, you have more things to draw from. But you can always also draw from the fact that they're there having a conversation with you, right? And that's a tough thing to do in and of itself, right? And so you can highlight sort of, I think it's really great that you're sharing this with me, and this is an important first step to kind of help you along to where you need to get. Problem solve and develop a plan, and then direct to natural supports. So I elaborate that a little bit here. So I like the idea of focusing on helping a student develop a plan even more than I like the idea of focusing on problem solving. Because as I said, a lot of times the problem might not be able to be solved, at least immediately, right? And that can feel like a lot of pressure on us to help a student solve a problem. That can feel sort of overwhelming. And also make us feel like not very effective if we're trying to look for solutions to something that like there's no immediate solution to. So sometimes what I think is a more helpful way to orient is helping the student develop a plan. And sometimes that plan might even be just helping the student think of, okay, what's a good thing to do next? What would be helpful to do from here? Just even kind of one step at a time. And if you go and do that and you want some help thinking through what next, then I'll be here too. But let's just focus on kind of like the next best thing to do. A helpful way to do that is to help them think through kind of, okay, what do we know about the situation and what don't we know? Are there any assumptions we're making? Is there any missing information that would be really helpful? Sometimes that sets you up well to come up with the plan or kind of the next step, you know. Once we have the unknowns, maybe the next step is, okay, we got to find a little more information. Who can we talk to kind of fill in these gaps, right? And sometimes that can relate to helping a student think through their other supports, right? So who else would be helpful to talk to about this? So when I say natural supports, I mean kind of what are the supports that are already embedded in the student's life, right? Things that they already have at their disposal. Sometimes when you're feeling distressed or feeling overwhelmed, it's really hard to like remember and to think through like, oh, okay, I can talk to this person, I can reach out to this resource, and, you know, I forgot about these things. Does anyone or everyone know about the peer counseling helpline? I see some head nods. And I also see some shaking heads. So the peer counseling helpline, there's a group of students that we as the counseling center train to be empathic listeners for students. And there's an anonymous line that students can call to talk to a peer counselor. These are for non-crisis situations, just for an empathic listener, right? Just somebody to help you. If you feel like you just need to share and you don't know who you can share with, or you want somebody to help you to maybe like do some of this problem solving, it's a nice resource to kind of keep in your back pocket if a student is having a difficult time thinking of who else can I talk to about this, right? Particularly for those non-crisis situations. So that number is on the Drexel Counseling website.
Yep.
Can
you talk a little bit about 7 Cups as well.
Yes, yes.
Which has just been rolled out.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. So another great resource is 7 Cups of Tea. The webpage is 7cups.org, I believe. .com. So it's another service that offers sort of empathic listeners via a chat system. We are in the process of getting Drexel students trained in 7 Cups, right? So it might be some of our peer counselors, but also like anybody else that just wants to do that. It's 24/7. And it's also international. So if a Drexel, right, like I said, right now we're trying to get Drexel students trained on that so that when a Drexel student kind of goes to that website and they log on, they could have the choice of, do you want to speak to another Drexel student? But also, if there's no Drexel students available, there's other listeners that are trained via this website, this organization, which is helpful. Like you can even search if you need somebody that speaks a particular language or something like that. And because it's 24/7, because it's like kind of an international thing, there's more availability, right? As opposed to the peer counseling helpline is available like Monday through Thursday, I think, like 8 to midnight. So that's another good option to keep in mind too. Okay. So identifying supports, also identifying coping skills, right? Helping a student think through, like, what are the things they know they can do to feel better? The way that I frame this usually is not that these things are going to solve the problem, but this is difficult. It's probably going to feel kind of tough for a little while. So just what are the things you can do to be kind to yourself right now or to help you kind of, to help make this a little bit easier, right? So some things to avoid. I'm conscious of time, so I might kind of move along to some of the tougher things like making that referral and how to deal with crisis situations, right? So we're going to 11:30, is that right? Okay. So what do I do when I make a referral to the counseling center? This might apply more when you're here on campus, but also just kind of when connecting students to mental health professionals in general. Sometimes it can feel scary to kind of suggest that, and what if the student, feels offended by that or, doesn't have a good reaction to that. I think some helpful ways to frame this, knowing, we can't always be sure how anybody's going to react to anything, right? A certain amount is outside of our control. We can do some things to help that go a little bit more smoothly. And something to remember is that oftentimes kind of referring somebody to further support, to a mental health professional, to counseling, can feel like a really validating thing. It can feel like, okay, you're really taking this seriously and it's important to you that I get some support. I think some ways to help kind of frame that suggestion is just, one, reflecting the things that you see, right? Here's some things that I've been noticing and that you've shared. And I really want to be able to support you, and I'm here to support you, but I'm also not an expert in these things. And there's some supports available to you. And then I'd encourage you, and I'd like to help you get connected to somebody that can be the most helpful for you with this situation, right? Yeah.
In my case, I used it myself when I was in school.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, because also what can be helpful is just destigmatizing it or even demystifying it, right? Sharing that lots of people go to counseling for different kinds of reasons. It's really a normal thing to do. Even sharing as much information as you have about like what it might be like when they kind of reach out, right? Even sharing, like I've talked to some of the counselors at the counseling center. This girl Emma came by, she seemed nice. Yeah.
How can we manage expectations of that timing? Because I think like the students, when they are, they want to call the counseling center and they want to see somebody that day. And my understanding is that things are really busy at the counseling center.
Yep.
That's not an option. So
Yep. So great question. So the question is, how do I do expectation setting with like timing of appointments and everything? So something to know about kind of what it looks like if somebody goes to the counseling center, which is helpful in just like providing that information too, is generally the student can call or they can come into our office, and at the front desk they can schedule an appointment. Our first appointments are shorter like assessment appointments, get an idea of what's bringing the student in, and then come up with a plan of what would be helpful for them. Because we just in the last couple of years kind of switched to this system where we have these shorter appointments for the initial appointments, we've been able to really move up and reduce the wait time for initial appointment such that a student is generally able to schedule within a day or two. If it ends up being farther out, it's usually because of their scheduling conflicts, right? So letting them know they should generally be able to meet with somebody within a day or two. If when they reach out for their first appointment, we have some kind of basic screening, and if it seems like they're generally going through maybe a crisis or something that needs more immediate attention than even a day, then we have things worked into our system that they'll be able to see somebody sooner. We can talk about that a little when we talk about crisis. Well, and maybe now is the time to talk about that. And so, we're able to do some assessment to kind of determine sort of, is it appropriate for the student to wait a day? And then sometimes if a student is like, I can't wait a day, I'm so stressed, I need somebody, that's when you might be able to help them just do a little bit of planning of kind of like, okay, well, what can you do in between? The reality is you might need to wait a day or two to be able to sit down with the therapist. How can we help you get through that time? Is there somebody else you can reach out to? Can you give your mom a call? Is your roommate good at kind of helping you through these things? Can you just, right? Yeah, you can reach out to 7 Cops. Can you just distract yourself for the time being until you're able to kind of approach this, watch a movie, etc., right? So just kind of helping them plan for the in-between can be helpful. So again, talking about crisis, this being those moments where there's that immediate threat of harm or danger to self or to others. This being the moment where you really need to ensure that they get contact with a mental health professional. So this would be feeling suicidal. This might be recently engaging in self-injury, threatening others, acting aggressively. As I said before, these are some of the indicators we kind of went through before. At the end of the day, you want to ask. You need to ask, and that's the best we can do at knowing for sure. Because a crisis can be so different from student to student that if you have that level of concern, you just ask. Oftentimes there can be concerns of, if I ask the question, am I going to put that thought into their mind? That's not going to happen. No question ever caused somebody to feel suicidal. Is there a chance that they might feel uncomfortable that I asked? Yeah. They might feel weird. They might be like, what? No, I don't feel that way. That's okay. We're willing to risk that moment of discomfort, right? Yeah, right. And we're willing to risk that moment of discomfort for the sake of recognizing the students that are going through that, right? So it can feel like an uncomfortable question to ask. I encourage you to practice just getting familiar with saying these words, just to get some of the discomfort out of your system, let those words feel familiar in your mouth, right? Practice at home, asking in the mirror, let your loved ones know what you're doing so they don't get freaked out. Practice with each other, right? Just asking the question. Sometimes it can be scary to ask because it's like, well, if they say yes, then what do I do, right? And so, again, this is the idea of today of knowing that if they say yes, it's not then your responsibility, still not your responsibility to solve those problems. Now you just need to know, you go through the protocol to get them to the help that they need. So the protocol can be a little bit different, I think, if you're abroad or if you're on campus. And I was hoping that maybe Marcia could talk a little bit about sort of the protocol if you're abroad.
Sure. So, if you're in one of these crisis situations, the first thing we want to do is, validate the students, how they're feeling, and then be sure that we're getting them the immediate support that they need, which can be challenging, especially since I think most of you are doing short-term programs where you're on a schedule, and this is not part of the schedule. But this is one of those things where we have to take the time and get the mental health professional that can work directly with the student. And so, through On Call International, they can put us in contact with mental health professionals. Our team has also worked to put together a list of crisis support lines in a lot of different countries that are like national support lines where you can actually just call in, and it's part of a broader effort for suicide prevention. But you can call On Call to get that immediate referral. The other thing I would say is that if you're in one of these situations and you're just really not sure what to do, you can always call the Drexel International Emergency line, which goes to my phone, and we can talk it through what needs to be done, how we can approach this in the best interest of the student. So, one of the things that we really have been trying to do is partner more with counseling. In worst case scenarios, if we cannot find a mental health professional that's there, we have had students sometimes call the counseling line here, because that is also manned 24/7. Obviously, that's a worst case scenario because it's best to get them support from someone who's there on location and can actually be there with them. But we do have a lot of resources available for that, and hopefully you're not going to experience that. But there are times where this does happen, and it's important for you to also know that you're not alone in this. Somebody will pick up one of those numbers and kind of help you through that. So
Thank you. And if you're on campus, there's also kind of like a flow of resources that you can look to, such that if it's office hours, you can reach out to our counseling center. If it's after hours, we have an on-call after-hours therapist that you can reach 24/7 for these crisis situations. And if it's something that you're pretty certain somebody needs to be there pretty immediately, then you can also always call DUPD as well. So I know I talked a big talk about leaving all this time for Q&A, and then here we are.
Even if you're international, you can call DUPD.
if you
No, so that was on campus, sorry.
Yeah, if you're on campus, if you call public, call me. If you call Drexel Public Safety, they have our numbers as well. So they're going to call us if you call them. So
But also, I think I would say also abroad, internationally, if it's a situation where you need that immediate response, then the local police is kind of the most, right, is the most immediate kind of intervention there. So I want to be sensitive to your time, and so I want to thank you all for being here and participating and listening. Really appreciate that. If anybody has, responsibilities that they have to get to, please feel free to be on your way. And if you have any questions you don't have time to ask, please feel free to reach out to me. I can give you my card, or you can reach out through Marcia and she can connect us. But also, I'm happy to kind of hang out and take questions for those that wanted to stick around and ask a question as well. So.
Will this PowerPoint be shared?
I can make the PowerPoint available. I also have a printout with kind of the highlights and the crisis protocol for on campus. So you can pick up one of these as well. Yeah. I'll just leave these here.
I just had a couple comments.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention for everyone, those of you who've led programs before, you are probably aware of this, but the Study of Education Abroad Office does require students to complete a medical history questionnaire as part of their acceptance materials, and students who disclose mental health, physical health, or any prescriptions that they're taking, we do reach out and make sure they're going to be supported while they're abroad. Now, a lot of students either aren't diagnosed or don't disclose, but for those that do, we reach out, and if there's something that's of particular concern, we will let the faculty know, and we'll have a conversation as to how we can best make sure that student is supported abroad. The other thing I wanted to mention I think is so important is, particularly for faculty like the intensive courses, is setting the expectation during the pre-departure orientation or any pre-departure meetings. Expectation meaning, one, that if they have any concerns, they are welcome to talk to you. Because I think with the intensive, they're so busy, and I think faculty leader has got their hands full, they're leading an entire group, they're managing the whole itinerary, doing all these things. And I personally found that sometimes students are hesitant, even if they would otherwise communicate something, any type of concern. But if you make that very clear on the front end, that they should communicate any type of concern, mental health, physical, or other, or if they see another student
Yeah.
that during free time seems like something is wrong or whatever, they're welcome to, they're always invited to communicate that. And the other point was the modeling. I think, again, from personal experience, modeling calm and not being stressed out in general in managing these programs, because plans may change, your transport shows up late. It's easy to kind of off the cuff make a complaint or express your own frustration about how something's not going exactly how you planned. And I think that in general can create stress in the group, in particular for students who already are dealing with anxiety or stress. So just modeling our own kind of calm and collected response to executing the programs in general is so helpful, and setting that expectation on the front end that students, the flexibility that things may change.
Something will go wrong.
That
Right.
something
Will go
right,
wrong.
and that it's okay, and that we're gonna, we're gonna manage and navigate the whatever comes up.
Absolutely.
In a way that's calm, stress-free. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you. That's
Yeah.
really helpful.
Yeah, the other thing, and there's been a lot of focus on mental health issues in education abroad recently, and so that has pushed all of us to get more involved in this. And one of the things that has come up as a strategy for faculty, particularly those that do faculty-led, is to consider some of these mindfulness exercises as part of your programming. And for every faculty member, it's going to be different, your comfort level in doing that. You're not super comfortable leading something like that, you could just say, I've heard about this, it might be helpful for students, and you can give them online resources where they can do it. But to kind of give space for those things that, it's crazy on these ICAs where you're running around and you're going nonstop, and just to take a minute, to plan a minute of just like quiet contemplation for everyone can sometimes, I think, be very grounding and helpful. And I think that also does give students that space to say like, oh, yeah, this is different from what I expected. So, I think it's an interesting challenge, especially with that model, with the hectic pace of it. But I think taking that time may have some good benefits. And I think also establishing in your pre-departure orientation that sense of community and how we're all going to watch out for each other. I think that's one of the nice things that's come out of a lot of these ICAs is that sense of community. They all want to get together after they come back and hang out because they've experienced something together, but also because they've been with a smaller group where they really felt seen, which is nice. So, and then you don't have to call me because
Nope, but if you hear me frantically typing out paraphrasing.
Thank you. For a minute, I was trying to do it mentally, and then at some point, I gave up because I wouldn't have done it justice. Well, again, thank you all. If you have questions you want to come up with me about, please feel free to do so. And I also want to respect your time, so thank you. Yeah.